at gShift. And joining me today for our webinar on getting started with influencer marketing is Erin McKenna, who's our resident influencer marketing guru or product strategist or product specialist, as her title indicates there. So we're going to get going and hopefully provide you with some great info on getting started with your influencer marketing. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we do move forward. We are going to be recording this webinar, so if you're not able to stay with us the entire time, we'll be sending out a recording for anybody who's registered in the next day or so. We've left everybody on mute just to keep the noise down, but if you have any questions at all, please feel free to enter them into the questions window here in GoToWebinar, and we'll make sure that we get to them at the end of the session. And by all means, we'd certainly like to have you all tweet along with us and share some of the insights you're getting from today's session. You'll see we have a hashtag down there, Influencer Marketing 101. And you're also more than welcome to follow both Erin and myself and or gShift Labs on Twitter for ongoing info around influencer marketing, among other things. Just give you a quick sense of our agenda. We're going to start by just giving a quick overview of influencer marketing in general, obviously a hot topic and the reason you're all here wanting to learn more. We'll touch a little bit on exactly where influencer marketing came from, ultimately, how you work influencer marketing into your marketing mix, as well as talking a little bit about what we call the dark funnel, and how you're able to better track and measure your influencer marketing campaigns for success. We'll touch on the steps of an influencer marketing campaign. We'll look at some best practices for how to engage with, interact with, and run a successful campaign. And then again, some QA right at the end of the session. So please do feel free to put your questions in, whether it's during the session or not, and we'll make sure that we cover those at the end. But before we jump in, one of the things we'd like to do is run a little quick poll. We've been running an ongoing poll last couple of weeks here at gShift, and if we could get you all to maybe just give us some quick feedback on a couple of questions, or a question, a single question that we have, should be coming up on the screen here in just a moment. So what we'd like to know is how many marketing technologies do you use in a given month? And by marketing technologies, I'm sure you're all familiar with the marketing stack or the range of solutions that are available out there today. So we've mentioned here a few: Marketo, HubSpot, MailChimp, email, any or all of the Google tools that are available. Of course, gShift, Hootsuite, among others. So if you can just give a quick sense as to how many of those you think you use, and don't be shy. We're aware that there's a lot of people out there, a lot of marketers who are using multiple tools. Feel free to give us whatever your best guess is. We'll just let that run for a few seconds here, and then we'll proceed with the webinar. Excellent. So thank you for that. Without further ado, I'm going to pass this over to Erin. She's going to talk a little bit about influencer marketing, where it came from. I'll give you a quick overview, and then we'll get down into to some more details. Erin?
Great. Thank you, Jeff. Hi, everybody. So as Jeff mentioned, I'm Erin McKenna. So I'm the influencer marketing product specialist here at gShift. So I guess we'll kick it off and just kind of talk about, a high overview of what really influencer marketing is for those who are unfamiliar. So in theory, it's the newest and what we think is the most effective advertising distribution channel in reaching the millennial generation, or Gen Y. We also see the success in reaching other age groups that are really present on social media at this time. So we look at influencer marketing for leveraging the audience of topic specialists who are living in social environments. And we kind of refer to those as influencers. So they're basically any individual who has become a subject specialist or a topic specialist and essentially has influence over their own audience in that specific field. So influencer marketing is really based on the premise of peer reviews and influence from these individuals. It's used by major international brands today, and is really seen being leveraged through the most commonly used social networks. So next we want to talk about who really are these influencers. So they're credible, authentic individuals who have a significant following and are highly engaged with their audience, therefore leading into their influence. They elicit actions from and they range from influencers who are credible enthusiasts all the way up to celebrities who are kind of talking about whatever their niche specialty is. So they're found on different social platforms like Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, Pinterest, or blogs. Really, the social networks broaden from there as well. Influencers are not necessarily someone who has a lot of followers, but someone who's essentially influential over the following or the audience that they do have based on their insights and knowledge of that topic that they're talking about. So a lot of influencer marketing is really based on the trust and the peer-to-peer reviews between an audience member and the influencers.
Yeah, Erin, one thing that I've always talked about when thinking about influencers is some people can kind of refer to them as your trusted uncle. Who do people go to online that they trust for advice on purchasing a product? And so understanding who those trusted people is important to many brands, and a way of extending their reach beyond what they could maybe do by trying to connect with those audiences directly.
Yeah, absolutely. And we kind of like to point out that oftentimes influencers will just be your average Joe. It's somebody who has kind of either taken an affinity to a certain topic, or actually has some credibility behind that topic, and has now taken to social networks to amplify their good word, and their audience genuinely trusts their opinions and their reviews and all of their insights on that subject.
Yeah, we've even got some people here within gShift, yours truly being one of them. I'm a hockey dad of all things. Well, being Canadian, I guess that is sort of par for the course. But I've, for instance, been contacted by companies that are interested in leveraging my influence over other hockey parents. People who would be purchasing, equipment, sports equipment, hockey equipment, obviously. So, like Erin mentioned, it could just be your average Joe who happens to have a blog and happens to have some influence and a following. That's really the crux of influencer marketing, people that are trusted by others in their community.
Yeah, absolutely. So next we'll kind of move into where did influencer marketing come from. So, our biggest point here is that the consumers now don't necessarily trust brands. There's a bias there. So when we kind of talk about ad blocking and that growing industry, it's more so it's a new channel that we can leverage and kind of, it really is based on the premise of authenticity and credibility and engagement with your audience. So consumers are listening to the people that they trust. So it's kind of all about peer-to-peer recommendations. So we see that in the second stat here with 84% trust peer recommendations, where only 33% of consumers trust sponsored ads. The next stat takes us into another 84%, which is 84% of the first stat take actions from those peer opinions. The first stat we looked at here is 74% of consumers rely on social media to inform their purchasing decisions. So consumers listen to people they trust, and they go online to look for the reviews before making those decisions. So, as we said, ad blocking is a growing industry, and it's being used exponentially by your target audience. So it's important to figure out a new path in reaching that audience, and that's kind of where influencer marketing was born. So the marketers don't really have the control in the consumer journey anymore. So instead of forcing or kind of screaming your brand message through a megaphone to your audience, it's important to partner with people who your target audience is actually listening to and leveraging the influencer's influence. So we often talk about that, the importance of the influence comes down to several different variables, and one of them actually being the engagement with their audience and making sure that doesn't matter if they have a huge following necessarily. That is one aspect that kind of makes an influencer, but it's really going to depend on if their audience genuinely is influenced and trusts and listens to what it is that they're talking about. So next we can move into how influencer marketing really fits into your influencer marketing mix, sorry. So like I mentioned, we kind of consider it now a new channel of advertising distribution. So where before we were kind of, everyone was putting out TV commercials, well, now Netflix kind of deterred that, and we can avoid commercials like that. Radio, so many people nowadays are using other tools to stream their music, and they don't necessarily have to listen to the radio and pick up those advertisements. So for those who are spending so much time on social, influencer marketing has really just become, it's a new pathway to reach your audience, and it's a very niche and narrow focused audience. It's also extremely cost effective. So we see a $6.50 return for every dollar spent on influencer marketing efforts. So it's really minimizing any wasted dollars and making sure that you're really getting the best bang for your buck in reaching your audience members. Power of word of mouth, obviously we've always seen this in marketing. It's such a strong tool just to have people spreading the good word of your product or service. Influencer marketing essentially is that living on social. We have influencers who are supporting your brand and amplifying content on your behalf to their audience, and it becomes an individual to individual kind of exchange there. Lastly, we talk about the off-site challenges. So that leads into the dark funnel, and that's where I'm going to hand it off to Jeff to really cover that.
Excellent. I think that the quote down there on the bottom of the last slide from Scott Cook makes a lot of sense and is worth noting as well. Just talking again about the importance of influencer marketing, and that a brand is no longer what we tell the consumer it is. It's what the consumers tell each other it is. And we always here at gShift talk about the G in gShift being the Google shift, in that now it's a combination of influencers and your visibility in Google that effectively makes up your online brand. But I was going to talk more specifically about this notion of the dark funnel, which you may or may not have heard of. It's actually a term that we've coined recently, and it's a challenge, and it's worth noting here in terms of being able to monitor and measure the success of your influencer marketing campaign. So we wanted to give you kind of a bit of an overview and something to think about as we go through the process of talking about running an influencer marketing campaign. One of the challenges for marketers these days, and Erin alluded to the fact that you're trying to reach your audience within different points in their buyer journey. And a typical buyer journey or typical sales funnel looks very website centric, in that once someone gets to the website, we're able to start tracking and understanding what they're doing in terms of engaging with our content. The problem is that up to 90% of the purchasing journey these days is happening offsite, and nowhere more is that more true than in influencer marketing, and that all of that content resides externally to your website. So it lives on the influencer site. They're blogging on your behalf. They're maybe posting reviews on your behalf. They're just generally putting content out there and distributing it through their social channels. This is really where ultimately the influencers live, is in this dark funnel. And the challenge for marketers is that many don't have insight into what's happening with all of that content. And so in many ways, they're blind to that offsite engagement. And again, we just wanted to kind of set the tone or give you a sense as to one of the challenges you need to think about in terms of running influencer marketing campaigns, or thinking about leveraging influencers, because ultimately you're going to want to be able to define how you measure success, and how are you going to be able to measure what's happening with all of that offsite content and the engagement that that your audience is having with your influencers and the content they're publishing. So, really difficult for many to navigate that whole dark sales funnel and understand where people are interacting with and engaging with content before they reach the website. So we'll talk a little bit about that and how we can ultimately help or things you think about in terms of being able to deal with the dark funnel, but important to keep in mind when you're talking about measuring the overall success of a campaign. So I'm going to throw it back to Erin now and talk about just that, starting an influencer marketing campaign and running an effective campaign.
Awesome, thanks, Jeff. So here we just kind of have the agenda that we'll run through in starting and executing and kind of monitoring your influencer campaign. So step by step, we're looking at setting parameters, identifying your audience, creating a content strategy, identifying and engaging with these influencers, and monitoring and managing, measuring, reporting, and maintaining relationships. So essentially, this is a full cycle process that will allow you to have ultimate success in your influencer marketing campaign. So firstly, we'll look at setting parameters. So, as we have listed here on a pretty high level, it's important to identify key objectives, set realistic numbers, and allocate your budget. But kind of more in depth on that, for the first set, when we're looking at your goals, there's important questions to consider. Is your campaign setting out to increase reach? Are you looking to collect user-generated content? Is the campaign's purpose to generate brand affinity and awareness? Or are you simply looking to increase content engagement? These goals are a matter for the purpose of setting deliverables for the influencer and understanding the important measurables in the campaign for monitoring and reporting purposes. So these are really important, in the end, to look back on your campaign and decide ultimately whether or not it was successful and it was carried out as expected. So next we want to look at the numbers that are involved. So what are your measurables? This may depend on the social platform you're looking to leverage and engage with. So it might be likes, shares, impressions, retweets, views. There's all kinds of different metrics that we can look at that are specific to each different social network, and all of which are going to help you meet your goals. So it's very important, like any goals, to set attainable ones, ones that will allow you to report on success and plan for your next campaign as you grow, and hopefully your next campaign will be at a larger scale and might be dealing with bigger numbers. Lastly is the budget, and so it's very important and critical to the planning process, as any project really knows. To run a successful campaign, you need to allocate money to the process itself, so running the campaign and the hours that are dedicated to preparing the assets and content, the tools that are being used to identify and organize influencers, so whether it's a subscription that you have to these tools, the hours of execution for the campaign, and then any additional tools for monitoring and reporting the data for the campaign. But lastly, and maybe the most important part of your budget is the money that's going to be allocated for compensation to these influencers for their participation. So we'll look at some, or we can talk about some different things that an influencer might present to you with the rate card. And so an influencer, when you approach them in this process, are generally going to say, this is my audience size and this is what I'll work for. It's a very subjective industry, and everything that you're doing really depends on the subject means or the influencer involved in the campaign. So that's kind of where a negotiation process comes down. And we look at really talking to an influencer and looking to compensate them based on the engagement that their audience gets, some other scoring that we do with the influencers, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, and also just what they know of themselves and their involvement and influence over their audience. They'll generally present you with a number, and it's important to have that set aside in your budget.
So to be clear, Erin, while influencer marketing is relatively new, it's quickly maturing, and the influencers out there know that they're influencers, and there are sort of established parameters around which they now sort of engage with brands.
Certainly. So you'll see some influencers now, and like you said, it's a fairly new industry, but it's growing rapidly, and we might reach out to influencers now who and have their rate card and have already been engaging with brands for maybe a year in smaller campaigns. So they have a general idea of what they're worth, and there is a lot of control on the influencer end when it comes to running a campaign, because essentially in the end it's their audience. It's not your audience, it's theirs, and you're leveraging their influence over that audience. So they do have a lot of knowledge about their audience, and that's really important to kind of get from them in terms of figuring out if you're having an effective reach. So next we're going to talk about identifying your audience. So like we have here, understand who your audience is. This goes beyond knowing their demographics, what their interests are, and where they're at in the purchasing cycle, and where do they live online. So setting parameters for your target audience might include how active they are on social platforms, their geography, and their reach interests. But we can look here on taking an audience-centric approach, and that's kind of a way that we've talked about approaching influencer marketing, that it isn't necessarily always the same as your target market, your audience. Your influencer outreach audience is a more specific description of your consumer who you're targeting with any given campaign. So it's generally a more narrow and niche audience that branches from your target market and is identified by traditional demographics like age, location, gender, and income, but it also includes specific information like interests and purchasing practices and where they're living in social networks.
Our gShift's background is really in SEO and content marketing, and really influencer marketing is an offshoot, I'd like to think of that content marketing, of your content marketing efforts. Again, those influencers are effectively channel through which you're distributing your content. So in terms of identifying those influencers, one of the places we like to suggest starting is with your keywords in your content, is really understanding what keywords are the ones that you have some authority for and that have a relatively high monthly search volume, so that and or social mentions, so that you can focus in on those keywords that people are talking about and or searching for. Likewise, you're ultimately wanting to get these influencers to promote or to help boost the authority of some existing content, presumably existing content. You might be starting a new campaign, launching a specific promotion where it's relatively new content, but you can also use influencers to boost existing content and content that you already have some visibility or authority for. So understanding that and getting a sense as to what content you're looking for support on is important. Taking that into account, then, once you've identified your core keywords, your focus keywords, the ones that that you think or have done some research and have understood that people are searching for you on, you want to use those same keywords to search for influencers, whether socially or within the context of their site content. Obviously, you want to understand and find those influencers who are talking about the same things you're talking about. So starting with keywords is just a great place to do that. And then again, ultimately looking to have those same influencers promote and or link to your authoritative content. So let's get Erin maybe to talk a little about then, from taking that content, or it's sort of part and parcel with kind of thinking about content and having identified influencers. What's a creative brief really look like, and how you use that as a kind of core piece of organizing your campaign?
Thanks, Jeff. So successful campaigns have a lot of variables to consider when it comes to planning and strategizing, especially the creative aspects on the campaign. So depending on your subject matter, product or service, goals, and the influencers you're looking to engage with, you can customize a brief that is really to your liking for that specific campaign. However, when we strip it down to the bare bones, there are a few key questions that are huge in identifying how to build it effectively, and whose answers build a very strong brief. So we can see those right here on the screen. So it's about 8 questions, but again, most things in this industry are quite subjective. So depending on the subject matter of your campaign, you might be able to add, give or take, a few questions. Who's your audience for this campaign? So who really are you targeting? What are the specifics about that audience? What type of campaign is it? So is it about content amplification? Are you looking to have bloggers create some content for you? Are you simply looking to share some with them and have them amplify it? Is it an event? Is there a contest involved? There are so many different types of campaigns, and every time we have new clients come into us, sometimes they have new ideas that they're bringing to the table that we haven't even considered in terms of leveraging influencers. So what are the key messages? So these reflect back on the keywords. What are you really trying to amplify through these influencers? What is the end goal? What are the key messages? What's the call to action? Are you bringing the audience back to a landing page? Are you looking for certain conversions? Are you looking for purchases to be made? Is there a link for them to click that is essentially going to lead them back to a brand page? Where should the influencers publish the content? So this really comes down to where the influencer's biggest influence is, or where their largest engagement metrics are. So is it on their Facebook? Is it on their blog? Is it Instagram? So we do a scoring process, and again, I think I mentioned this earlier, that we'll touch on in a few more minutes. But this kind of allows you some insight as to where your content is going to be most effective through the influencer. Number 6, what are the mandatory deliverables and the timing? So are you looking to turn out a certain number of posts? Is there going to be, are we waiting for a certain number of likes or engagement with that post? Are the posts going to be spaced out? So maybe the campaign lasts for 3 months and we want 4 posts and we want them every few weeks. Maybe there's going to be a post every day for a 1-week campaign. So how will you measure the campaign success? So again, we'll kind of get into looking at measuring metrics and ways that we monitor and measure campaigns. And then other key information, so photos, resources, background information, samples. So next we'll get into identifying and engaging with your influencers. So it's, like I said before about the audience-centric approach, we really talk about 2 different approaches when it specifically comes to identifying your influencers. So the audience-centric approach really should be your default search practice. You should always be focused on the audience and trying to find that right audience and the influencer that has that audience. However, we do actually find a use for influence-centric approach to identifying your influencer, and this is usually specific to the style of campaign that you're working with. So this might come down to identifying very specific information in terms of demographics about the influencer. For example, if you are running a mommy blogger campaign or something surrounding expecting moms, you're really looking at a gender-specific influencer there. If you're, for example, running a consumer activation event and you're inviting many influencers to show up to this location or event, then the location of the influencer really does come into play, and that's really where an influence-centric approach to identification comes in. However, like I stated, audience-centric is really the way that we advise people to approach an influencer marketing strategy. Influencer-centric still requires some refining in the process and should be then filtered with the audience in mind. So once you do identify a large group of influencers through an influence-centric approach, you then want to look at their audience and really qualify each influencer from that group as to who has the right audience. So now I'm going to kind of look at explaining this graph. It's fancy, it's pretty, but it really talks about the sweet spot of influencers. So on the two axes, we have the number of followers and the number of influencers. So with celebrity influencers, we see a ton. There's tons of celebrities and they all have these huge followings. Like we can see the height of the graph really meets up to the number of followers. These individuals aren't necessarily engaging with their audience and don't necessarily have a total influence over their audience. So with that arrow in the background, we see that engagement rises the smaller the influencer is. So celebrity influencers have a huge following, and they're kind of that perfect example of where the following doesn't necessarily always matter, because they're not necessarily highly influential over their audience, and they're not necessarily engaging with their audience, and they may not be regarded as a peer by their audience. So the next type of influencer would be your macro influencers. So these are influencers with an audience size of 50,000 or 30,000, 20,000, but they are still engaged with their audience more so than the celebrity influencer, but they're on a larger scale. So they still are kind of developing that celebrity element to them, and they're going to cost more money when it comes to running a campaign. And that's where we really look at the ideal spot is right between the macro and micro influencers. So micro influencers have the highest engagement with their audience. They're responding to posts, they're following people back, they really have developed a relationship with their audience, and therefore their influence is more highly regarded. So that's where the engagement per capita of their following is at its peak, is with these micro influencers. And small businesses engaging with a smaller budget. So these influencers, earlier, they may not necessarily be doing influence professionally. It may still be a hobby, and they're writing their blog, and now they're being approached by brands. They're willing to work for less money, and they're willing to genuinely take an interest in your product and provide genuine reviews. Look at in influencer scoring is the authenticity, engagement, and credibility of an influencer. So the authenticity really being that these influencers are authentic with their influence to competitive brands within the same one brand, and they're willing to amplify your information for you and become compensated in a small amount to amplify that information. Next is micro influencers would have high engagement, celebrity would have low. So a way to score your influencers is to really look at what the engagement rates are. So how many retweets per 100 tweets, how many comments back, are they following their audience back? Lastly, we look at credibility. So credibility is really measured in different ways, really depending on the subject matter or the influencer. So for example, if you're looking at a family and relationship or parenting blog, the credibility is really based on, does this influencer have children? If not, then how credible can they be in the advice or the reviews or kind of the insights that they're giving on that subject matter? We also see this in other subject fields like health and medicine or pharmaceuticals. We want to make sure that the influencers that you're working with are credible in what they're talking about, and that it's not simply the average Joe just deciding that they're going to become influential in health and pharmaceuticals. There's someone who has some clout behind what they're talking about.
So Erin, I don't want to say I work cheap, but I guess you'd probably qualify me as a micro influencer with my my hockey dad blog that I mentioned before.
Yeah, I think so.
But you talk a lot about engagement there, and that's a really important piece of this. You want to make sure that the content that you're providing to your influencers is indeed being tracked and that you're able to get a sense of engagement. So, at the outset, you want to identify who your influencers are, but then over time, be able to actually track and keep a monitor how they're ultimately doing. So having engaged with them or identified them, now it's time to actually put some content in their hands. And we highly recommend, again, thinking about it almost from an SEO perspective or providing them with optimized content and optimized URLs that you're going to be able to track to get a sense of how people are actually engaging with that content. So we're talking there about providing influencers with, again, going back to keywords, keyword-rich titles, headings, and content so that they can ultimately optimize their posts. Not all influencers you engage with are going to necessarily be quote-unquote SEO savvy. So you want to try and make sure that they're armed with the right content that's going to ultimately help them improve the visibility of that content. In addition to that, you want to provide them with trackable, what we call smart URLs to your content, as well as URLs that they're going to use to share out that content through the different social channels that they're sending through. So if if they're publishing a post and they're going to be distributing that, or you'd like them to distribute that through Facebook, Twitter, and Pinterest, give them 3 separate URLs that allow you to track engagement across those 3 channels. So you're thinking of the influencers themselves as channels. You want to track which influencers are most effective or which channels are most effective, but then you also want to track their channels. So which influencers within which channels will give you some good metrics to be able to optimize your campaigns moving forward. And again, remember this notion of the dark funnel. That's where these smart URLs really come into play, enabling you to track what's happening with all of this content that doesn't reside on your website. So let's talk a little bit about then monitoring and managing these campaigns, these ongoing campaigns. And really here we're talking about monitoring content engagement, again, by influencer and by channel. And we think about 2 different types of monitoring, or 2 types of engagement. Likes and shares are almost a given, thinking about those though as soft engagement. So it's really easy for someone to like a piece of content. A little more difficult to share. So by sharing your saying that piece of content is something that you're giving your stamp of approval to. So it's a little more difficult for people out there on social to share. So you might hold those in a little higher regard than the like. That being said, both of those still are not true or real engagement. And what real engagement means is clicks. So you want to be able to, again, use something like a smart URL to be able to track that actual engagement with your content and understand whether or not people are not just reading and liking and sharing, but actually engaging with and clicking through on that content to whatever destination point you have for them. The other thing you want to measure in terms of the content that you're having your influencers share is its organic search visibility, as well as your own. So how is that content that they're publishing ranking? Fresh new content does get noticed by Google. For that matter, tweets these days get noticed by Google by virtue of the fact that they have a partnership with Twitter. But you'll want to be able to pay attention to how and or what effect the content that influencer is publishing has on your content. And of course, you also want to understand how theirs is doing. Think of that content, again, that they're publishing as an extension of your web presence. It's an extension of your brand. You're just doing it through their reach. From monitoring and measuring, which is something that you're doing in real time so that you can adjust as the campaign's ongoing, we want to move and talk more about measuring and reporting, which is what happened and or a little bit more historical. And again, there you want to track and report on engagement by influencer, by channel. You might also want to track by content type. So is the influencer putting out, is it a blog post? Are they doing a video? Have they posted an infographic? You want to understand what types of content are performing better than others. And you might also want to track by content or keyword group, which keywords within the content, and perhaps you're using different keywords or different groupings across different influencers, and or through different channels that they're distributing through. All of these can be measured and monitored so that you can have a better understanding of how to optimize that next campaign. Use that information to inform your decisions moving forward. The other thing you can think about doing, and you'll see a graphic over here on the right, is creating conversion paths to map content engagement all the way through to some conversion point, and ultimately to a return on investment of all of this influencer marketing that you're doing. So we can set up step-by-step tracking of each of the pieces of content that have been created, whether it's the initial post on the influencer's blog, the sharing of that content through the social networks, and or the final click through to, say, a form or a thank you or a welcome page on a website. Once they fill in that form, we can see the submission all the way through to sort of full conversion. And there again, you can start to get a sense of the return on your investment. You also want to report on and pay attention to improvements in your organic search visibility. So again, by virtue of the fact that the influencer posted some content linked back through to you, did you see any benefit, and or simply did that piece of content rank well? Did it get organic visibility over time? And that's not something that's necessarily going to happen immediately. That's something you're going to want to pay attention to over time, as organic search rank can take time to actually happen. But again, it's an important piece to think about in terms of reporting. Last but not least, use that data and that reporting as a loop back to your influencers to keep them engaged, so they know how well they did. We're going to talk about making sure that you're maintaining a relationship with these influencers, and you want to let them know how their content is performing so that they can likewise improve over time. That's in their best interest to improve their quote unquote author score and their reach and their engagement with their audience. So giving them that data back as a feedback loop can be beneficial down the road as you continue to engage with those influencers. And we just wanted to put in again a quick point around the fact that it really is a relationship that you're establishing with these influencers over time. It's not a one-night stand. You want to stay in contact with them after the campaign's over. Again, I just talked about giving them feedback in terms of how their content's being engaged, and you want to build a relationship with them over time. Any sort of real fruitful relationship with an influencer is going to take time to evolve. They're going to get to know and become more comfortable with your brand and the messaging that you want to disseminate through them. So important to build that relationship.
So now we can just kind of touch on the key takeaways here at the end of the presentation. So from top to bottom, it's really important to take an audience-centric approach in identifying your influencers. Again, when we really said that when it comes down to it, you could do an influence-centric and audience-centric, but when you're deciding on that final influencer, it's really going to matter who their audience is and where they're living. Again, micro-influencers like Jeff, they generally produce more engagement. They're highly engaged with their audience. They're responding, and they've built a relationship with them. Co-creating content with influencers is optimum for audience resonation. So it's really making sure that you're sticking with the theme that the influencer has already been using, and it's not too branded, and it's not too company for their audience. It's really coming back to the authenticity of the influencer themselves. Again, it's important to identify a means to track the offsite content, so kind of looping back to the dark funnel that Jeff talked about. Setting campaign goals and establishing metrics to monitor and measure the success against those goals. So making sure that you have some tangible numbers that you're really looking at when running the campaign to make sure that you're ultimately having success.
Excellent. Thanks, Erin. So we do have some time for questions. I realize that we've gone over a little bit our advertised time limit here, but we certainly appreciate everyone sticking around. And as mentioned, we'll be sending out a recording of this after. There were a couple of questions specific to smart URLs and where to ultimately find or use those. As of course, chance would have it, we do have a smart URL service within gShift called Contextuals. which effectively enables you to measure the engagement with offsite content. Absolutely happy to provide any additional information anyone may have on those. I'll also point out here, you'll see we've got two guides that are available for download from our site, one on audience development discoverability, the other on mastering smart URLs, that you're happy to or welcome to download at any point. Erin, thank you very much for your time and expertise. Look forward to talking to you again shortly too. Thank you, everyone.